The smell of death hung heavy in the air that morning in Charleston, South Carolina. It was March 15, 1847, and the Whitmore plantation house was eerily silent. Inside the grand dining room, 3 bodies lay slumped over their breakfast plates. Master Thomas Whitmore, his wife Elena, and their eldest son James, all dead. The only sound was the gentle clinking of silverware as a young black woman calmly cleared the table, her face revealing no emotion whatsoever. This was Hannah Morrison, and with nothing more than a handful of oleander leaves and a steady hand, she had just changed the course of American history. But how did a kitchen slave become one of the most feared resistance fighters in the antebellum South? How did a woman who could neither read nor write orchestrate a revolution that spread fear through the hearts of slave owners across 3 states? Before we dive into this intense journey, click the subscribe button, like the video, and comment below on what surprises you most about the resistance of slaves in the United States. This helps the story reach more people. To understand Hannah's story, we must first understand Charleston in the 1840s. This coastal city was the beating heart of the American slave trade. Ships arrived weekly from Africa, their human cargo sold at the old slave mart on Chalmers Street. The cobblestone streets echoed with the chains of newly arrived Africans, while wealthy plantation owners like Thomas Whitmore grew richer by the day. Charleston was a city of contradictions. Grand mansions lined the Battery, their wraparound porches overlooking Charleston Harbor, while just blocks away, slaves lived in cramped quarters behind their masters' homes. The city's economy depended entirely on slave labor. From the rice plantations along the Ashley River to the cotton fields stretching inland toward Columbia. Hannah Morrison was born in 1820 on the Whitmore plantation, located 15 miles northwest of Charleston along the Ashley River. Her mother, Celia, was the head cook for the plantation's main house, a position that came with both privilege and danger. Head cooks knew all the family secrets, handled all the food, and had access to every room in the house. They also bore the brunt of their master's anger when meals weren't perfect. Hannah's father was never officially acknowledged, but everyone on the plantation knew he was Thomas Whitmore himself. This made Hannah what was cruelly called a house slave, light-skinned enough to work indoors, but never light enough to be free. Her mixed heritage became both her greatest asset and her deepest source of pain. As a child, Hannah showed unusual intelligence that both impressed and worried the other slaves. While most children her age played in the dirt between the slave quarters, Hannah would sit quietly in corners, listening to conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. She had an extraordinary memory. She could repeat entire conversations word for word days later, and she never forgot a face, a name, or a slight. Celia recognized her daughter's gifts early. "Child," she would whisper as they worked together. In the kitchen, "You got a mind sharper than any knife in this house, but sharp things can cut both ways. You use that mind wrong and it'll be the death of you. You use it right and maybe, it'll be the death of them." The Whitmore plantation kitchen was Hannah's first classroom. Built as a separate building behind the main house to prevent fires, it was a world unto itself. The massive fireplace dominated one wall, with iron hooks for hanging pots and a complex system of cranes for moving heavy kettles. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ceramic jars of spices, dried herbs, and preserved foods. In the center stood a huge wooden table, scarred from years of chopping and preparation. It was here that Celia taught Hannah not just cooking, but survival. "Every plant gets a purpose," Celia would say, grinding herbs with her mortar and pestle. "Some heal, some harm, some kill. A cook who knows her plants holds more power than any overseer with a whip." Hannah learned to identify every plant on the plantation grounds. She knew that willow bark could ease pain, that foxglove could slow a racing heart, and that castor beans could cause violent illness. Most importantly, she learned about oleander, the beautiful flowering shrub that grew wild throughout South Carolina. Every part of the oleander plant is deadly poisonous, but it's nearly impossible to detect in food if prepared correctly. "Why are you teaching me this, Mama?" young Hannah asked one day when she was 12. Watching Celia carefully separate dangerous plants from cooking herbs, Celia looked toward the main house, where they could hear Master Whitmore shouting at one of the field hands. Because knowledge is the only thing they can't take from you, child. They can sell your body, break your spirit, but they can't steal what's in your head. And sometimes what's in your head is the only weapon you've got. Hannah's childhood was marked by the constant brutality that defined slave life. She watched her friends sold away from their families without warning. She saw grown men whipped until they couldn't stand, women violated by overseers, children worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. But it was a specific incident when she turned 14 that would shape the rest of her life. On a sweltering August morning in 1834, Hannah's younger brother, Moses, only 10 years old, was caught taking a peach from the Whitmore's orchard. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The slave rations had been reduced because the cotton crop was smaller than expected. The boy was simply starving. Thomas Whitmore decided to make an example of Moses. He ordered all the slaves to gather in the courtyard to witness what happened to thieves. Hannah stood frozen as her baby brother was tied to the whipping post. The first lash tore through his small shirt. The second drew blood. By the fifth lash, Moses had stopped crying and hung limply from his bonds. "Please, master," Celia cried out, breaking from the group. "He's just a child. He's just hungry." Whitmore turned, his cold gray eyes toward Celia. "Hungry? Well, then let's give him something to really cry about." He nodded to the overseer, who raised the whip again. 20 lashes later, Moses hung unconscious. Hannah counted every single one, burning the number into her memory. 20 lashes, for a 10-year-old boy who took one peach because he was starving. As the other slaves dispersed, Hannah helped her mother carry Moses back to their cabin. He would survive, but he was never quite the same. His spirit broken along with several ribs. That night, as Hannah held cold cloths to her brother's wounds, something fundamental shifted inside her. The fear that had always lived in her chest transformed into something else. A cold, calculating hatred that would burn steady as a candle flame for the next 13 years. "Mama," she whispered in the darkness, "tell me more about those plants. Tell me everything." From that night forward, Hannah's education took on a darker purpose. During her morning walks to collect herbs for cooking, she began gathering other specimens. She learned that moonflower seeds could cause hallucinations, that pokeweed berries could cause respiratory failure, that deathcap mushrooms looked remarkably similar to safe varieties but would shut down the liver within days. She began experimenting on rats first, then on sick chickens that were going to be killed anyway. She learned about dosages, about timing, about how different poisons affected the body. Most importantly, she learned about subtlety. A good poisoner, she realized, made death look like accident or natural causes. As Hannah grew older, her position in the house evolved. By age 16, she had become her mother's primary assistant, responsible for preparing breakfast and lunch, while Celia handled the more elaborate dinner preparations. This gave Hannah unprecedented access to the Whitmore family's daily routines. She learned that Thomas Whitmore took his coffee black with 2 spoons of sugar every morning at exactly 7:00. Elena Whitmore preferred tea with honey and always ate toast with orange marmalade. James Whitmore, now 22 and as cruel as his father, liked his eggs over easy and his bacon crispy. She learned their schedules, habits, preferences, and weaknesses. Hannah also began building relationships with slaves on other plantations. The network of communication between plantations was sophisticated. Field hands who traveled between properties, house slaves who accompanied their masters to social events, and freedmen who worked as artisans in Charleston all carried information back and forth. Through this network, Hannah learned that the cruelty she experienced wasn't unique to the Whitmore plantation. She heard stories of masters who worked slaves to death, of families torn apart and sold to different states, of women brutalized and children abandoned. She heard about plantation owners who threw elaborate parties while their slaves ate scraps, who built grand mansions while their workers lived in conditions worse than their livestock. But she also heard whispers of resistance. She learned about slaves who had successfully escaped via the Underground Railroad, about small acts of sabotage that cost masters money, about work slowdowns that disrupted harvests. Most intriguingly, She heard rumors about other house slaves who had taken more permanent action against particularly brutal masters. There was a cook up in Virginia. An old field hand named Samuel told her during one of the rare times she was allowed to visit the quarters. Name's Martha. Her master used to beat his slaves with an iron poker, leave them scarred for life. One day, old Martha put something special in his stew. They found him 3 days later, stiff as a board. Doctor said it was his heart, but Martha knew better. "What happened to Martha?" Hannah asked. Samuel shrugged. "Nothing. Nobody suspected the cook. Master's brother inherited the plantation, treated folks a whole lot better. Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways." These stories planted seeds in Hannah's mind. She began to see patterns. Masters who died under mysterious circumstances often had histories of exceptional cruelty. The deaths were always attributed to natural causes or accidents. But Hannah began to suspect there was a network of house slaves taking justice into their own hands. By 1840, Hannah had become the most trusted house slave on the Whitmore plantation. At 20 years old, she was beautiful, intelligent, and completely invisible to the white family she served. They spoke freely in front of her, discussed business and politics, revealed their fears and prejudices, never imagining that she was listening to every word and remembering everything. She learned that Thomas Whitmore owed significant money to banks in Charleston, that the plantation was struggling financially, and that he was considering selling several slave families to pay his debts. She discovered that James Whitmore was planning to marry a young woman from Savannah whose father owned 3 plantations, a union that would make the Whitmores one of the wealthiest families in South Carolina. Most disturbingly, she learned about their future plans for the plantation's slaves. During a dinner party in late 1840, she overheard Thomas telling his guests about his intention to breed his slaves more systematically, treating them like livestock to maximize profit. "For the key is selective breeding," he explained, his voice louder than usual. "Keep the strong bucks, sell off the weak ones. Force the women to mate with the best specimens. In 10 years, I'll have the finest slave stock in the Carolinas." Hannah froze in the doorway, a tray of dirty dishes in her hands. He was talking about her friends, her family, her people, as if they were animals. She thought about her mother, Celia, now 45, showing signs of arthritis from decades of kitchen work. She thought about Moses, still bearing scars from his childhood whipping. She thought about the young women in the quarters who would be forced into Thomas Whitmore's breeding program. That night, Hannah made her decision. She would not wait for freedom. She would not hope for rescue. She would not pray for deliverance. Instead, she would deliver justice herself, using the one weapon at her disposal: her knowledge of plants, her access to food, and her invisible position in the house. The next morning, Hannah began her careful preparations. She started gathering oleander leaves, drying them slowly, and grinding them into a fine powder that looked remarkably similar to black pepper. She tested her mixture on rats, perfecting the dosage needed to cause death that would look like heart failure. She studied the Whitmore family's breakfast routine with new intensity, noting exactly how much sugar Thomas added to his coffee, how Elena stirred her tea, how James seasoned his eggs. For 6 months, Hannah planned every detail. She couldn't act impulsively. One mistake would mean not just her death, but brutal punishment for every slave on the plantation. She had to be perfect, patient, and completely invisible until the moment she struck. As winter turned to spring in 1847, Hannah felt ready. The Whitmores had become even more cruel over the harsh winter months, taking out their financial frustrations on their slaves. 3 field hands had died from overwork and malnutrition. 2 women had been sold to settle debts, torn away from their children and husbands. The breaking point came when Thomas Whitmore announced his intention to sell Moses to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, a death sentence disguised as a sale. On the night of March 14, 1847, Hannah lay awake in her small room behind the kitchen, listening to the sounds of the plantation. Tomorrow would be the day. Tomorrow she would serve breakfast for the last time. Tomorrow the Whitmore family would pay for 13 years of brutality with their lives. As dawn broke over Charleston harbor, Hannah rose and began preparing what would become the most infamous breakfast in South Carolina history. The morning of March 14th, 1847 began like any other at the Whitmore plantation. But Hannah Morrison knew it would be the last ordinary day of her life. As she walked through the morning mist toward the kitchen house, carrying a basket of eggs from the chicken coop, she heard the sound that would seal the fate of the Whitmore family, the jangle of slave chains coming up the dirt road. A slave trader's wagon was approaching the plantation, drawn by 2 tired mules. Hannah recognized the driver immediately, Josiah Fletcher, one of Charleston's most notorious slave dealers. Fletcher specialized in buying slaves from financially struggling plantations and reselling them to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, where the average life expectancy was less than 7 years. Thomas Whitmore emerged from the main house, already dressed and clearly expecting Fletcher's arrival. Hannah ducked behind the kitchen building and listened as the 2 men conducted their business. "I can pay you $800 for the boy," Fletcher said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "That Moses has some size on him, and the sugar masters like them strong. Won't last long, but they'll get good work out of him first. $800 seems fair," Whitmore replied. "He's been trouble anyway. Maybe Louisiana will teach him some respect." Hannah felt her world tilt. Moses, her baby brother, who had never fully recovered from that childhood beating, was being sold to what amounted to a death sentence. And Thomas Whitmore was discussing it like he was selling livestock, not destroying a human life. "I'll take him today," Fletcher continued. "Got a ship leaving Charleston Harbor tomorrow morning. Easier to transport them when they don't. Have time to say goodbye to family. Makes them more cooperative." As Hannah crouched behind the kitchen, something inside her snapped. All the years of careful planning, all the patient preparation, none of it mattered now. Fletcher would chain Moses and drag him away before Hannah could execute her carefully laid plans, unless she acted immediately. But as she watched Fletcher inspect Moses like he was examining a horse for purchase, Hannah realized this wasn't just about saving her brother anymore. This was about sending a message that would echo across every plantation in South Carolina. The house slaves of the region had been whispering for years about taking action. Hannah would be the one to fire the first shot. She spent the rest of that morning refining her plan with deadly precision. The Whitmore family always ate breakfast together at 7 o'clock sharp. Thomas, his wife Elena, and their son James. They were creatures of habit, which made them predictable targets. More importantly, they always ate in the main dining room away from the kitchen, which meant Hannah would have several minutes between serving the food and the family actually eating it. But timing would be everything. Too much oleander powder and they would taste it. Too little and they might survive. Hannah had spent months calculating the exact dosage needed for each family member based on their weight and eating habits. Thomas weighed approximately 200 pounds and always ate heartily. Elena was smaller, maybe 130 pounds, but she picked at her food. James was young and strong, probably 170 pounds, and he ate quickly. Hannah retrieved her carefully prepared oleander powder from its hiding place, a small ceramic jar buried beneath the kitchen floorboards. The powder was so fine, it looked identical to black pepper, and she had tested it thoroughly on rats to ensure the dosage was lethal but undetectable. As she worked, Hannah's mind was calculating more than just poison dosages. She was thinking about the network of house slaves across Charleston and the surrounding plantations. Word would spread quickly about what happened at the Whitmore plantation, and Hannah wanted to ensure that word carried the right message. She had been building relationships with other house slaves for years through the complex communication system that existed between plantations. Sarah, who cooked for the Middleton plantation on the Ashley River, had been sharing information about her master's cruelties. Mary, a seamstress for the Pinckney family in Charleston, had been learning to read by secretly studying her mistress's letters. Rebecca, who managed the household for a rice plantation near Georgetown, had been documenting every instance of sexual abuse she witnessed. These women were part of an informal network that Hannah had been cultivating since she turned 18. They called themselves the Invisible Army, house slaves who moved through white society completely unnoticed while gathering intelligence and planning small acts of sabotage A spoiled batch of preserves here, a ruined dress there, mysterious accidents that cost their masters money and time. But what Hannah was planning went far beyond petty sabotage. She was planning murder, and she needed her network to understand the significance of her actions. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated justice. She was declaring war on behalf of every slave who had been beaten, sold, violated, or murdered by the plantation system. Hannah had spent the previous evening sending coded messages through the slave communication network. Field hands who traveled between plantations carried her words to house slaves throughout the Low Country. The cook sends word that tomorrow's breakfast will be specially seasoned. She hopes her neighbors will remember the recipe. Every house slave in the region would understand the message. Hannah was telling them that she was finally ready to act and they should be prepared for the consequences that would follow. As Hannah prepared the breakfast that would make history, she thought about the broader implications of her actions. She had been studying the white family's conversations for years, learning about their fears, their financial troubles, and their political concerns. She knew that plantation owners throughout the South were already nervous about slave rebellions, especially after Nat Turner's uprising in Virginia 16 years earlier. What Hannah understood, and what made her plan so sophisticated, was that fear was more powerful than violence. Killing the Whitmore family would certainly be satisfying revenge, but it would also terrify every plantation owner in the region. They would realize that their most trusted slaves, the ones who prepared their food, cared for their children, and knew their most intimate secrets, could turn against them at any moment. Hannah had observed how white families interacted with their house slaves and had identified their greatest vulnerability. They trusted the very people they oppressed. Thomas Whitmore never questioned the food Hannah served him. Ella Lanena Whitmore never worried that her tea might be poisoned. James Whitmore never considered that the young woman who cleaned his room might be planning his death. This trust was based on the white community's racist belief that enslaved people were naturally subservient and lacked the intelligence to plan sophisticated resistance. Hannah intended to shatter that illusion permanently. If this story is gripping you, don't forget to like the video and comment what you would do in the protagonist's place. Subscribe for more powerful narratives of struggle and survival. The psychological aspect of Hannah's plan was as carefully crafted as the poison itself. She had spent years observing how the Whitmore family dealt with stress and conflict. Thomas became violent when challenged. Ella Lanena retreated into denial when faced with unpleasant realities. James relied on his father's authority to solve problems. None of them would be prepared to handle the systematic elimination of their power structure. More importantly, the other plantation owners in the region would be forced to confront the reality that they were vulnerable in their own homes. Hannah also understood the legal implications of her actions. South Carolina law in 1847 was clear. Any slave who killed a white person would be executed, usually by public hanging. But Hannah had studied enough mysterious deaths of cruel masters to know that house slaves could often avoid suspicion if they were careful. The key was making the deaths look natural. Oleander poisoning mimicked heart failure almost perfectly. The victims would experience chest pain, difficulty breathing, and eventual cardiac arrest. In an era before modern forensic science, it would be nearly impossible to prove poisoning, especially if the victims had been under stress or had pre-existing health conditions. Thomas Whitmore had been complaining about chest pains for months, attributing them to financial worries. Ella Lanena suffered from what she called nervous conditions and often felt faint. James drank heavily and had gained weight over the past year. All three had plausible reasons for sudden heart problems. Hannah's plan also accounted for what would happen after the deaths. She knew that suspicion would initially fall on field slaves, especially those with histories of defiance. The white community would assume that any resistance came from the dangerous slaves who worked in the fields, not from the trusted house slaves. This gave Hannah several advantages. First, she would be above suspicion during the initial investigation. Second, she would be in a position to influence the narrative by sharing information about potential suspects. Third, she could use her position to help other slaves avoid punishment for crimes they didn't commit. But Hannah's ultimate goal went beyond simply avoiding capture. She wanted to start a revolution, and revolutions required more than one successful action. She needed to inspire other house slaves to follow her example, while also avoiding the massive crackdown that would follow if white authorities understood the true scope of the conspiracy. Her solution was elegant in its simplicity. She would make her action look like an isolated incident while secretly communicating its true significance to other house slaves. The white community would see the Whitmore deaths as a tragic accident or the work of a single disturbed individual. But the enslaved community would understand that Hannah had declared open war on the plantation system. To achieve this, Hannah had developed a sophisticated communication strategy. The coded language she had been using for years would allow her to spread the real story of what happened without alerting white authorities. Phrases like, "the cook's new recipe," or "breakfast was especially satisfying," would let other house slaves know that poisoning was a viable form of resistance. More importantly, Hannah had been teaching other slaves to identify and prepare plant-based poisons. During her visits to other plantations, she had shared her knowledge of oleander, foxglove, castor beans, and other deadly plants that grew wild throughout South Carolina. She presented this information as medical knowledge, teaching them which plants to avoid to keep their families safe. But the most observant slaves understood the dual nature of this education. Plants that could heal could also harm, and knowledge of deadly vegetation could be a powerful weapon in the right hands. Hannah had also been documenting the cruelties of masters throughout the region, creating a mental catalog of which plantation owners deserved to die first. She had identified at least a dozen masters who were exceptionally brutal, including several who regularly raped their female slaves, and one who had worked 3 slaves to death in the past year. These men would be the next targets if Hannah's plan succeeded. She had already begun sharing information about their daily routines, their food preferences, and their vulnerabilities with the house slaves who served them. As the sun climbed higher on March 15, 1847, Hannah made her final preparations. She carefully measured portions of oleander powder for each member of the Whitmore family, double-checking her calculations one last time. She reviewed the morning routine, confirming that she would have the necessary window of opportunity to doctor their food without being observed. Most importantly, she prepared herself psychologically for what she was about to do. Hannah had never killed anyone before, but she had been preparing for this moment for years. She thought about Moses, who would be chained and dragged away to Louisiana if she didn't act. She thought about her mother, Celia, whose arthritis was getting worse from decades of kitchen labor. She thought about every slave who had been whipped, sold, raped, or murdered on the Whitmore plantation. But Hannah also thought about the future she was trying to create. Every house slave in the region would hear about what happened at the Whitmore plantation. Some would be inspired to take similar action. Others would find new courage to resist in smaller ways. A few might even find the strength to escape. The revolution Hannah was starting wouldn't be fought with guns or swords. It would be fought with poison and patience, with intelligence and invisibility. It would be a war waged by the people white society trusted most and suspected least. Hannah lit the fire in the kitchen hearth and began preparing what would become the most infamous breakfast in South Carolina history. She whispered a prayer to the ancestors who had survived the Middle Passage, endured centuries of bondage, and passed down the knowledge that was about to change everything. The time for patience was over. The time for justice had arrived, and Hannah Morrison, the invisible cook, who had spent her life serving the people who oppressed her, was about to serve them their final meal. March 15, 1847, dawned gray and humid over the Whitmore plantation. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from the ancient oak trees lining the dirt road to the main house, and an unseasonable fog rolled in from Charleston harbor, muffling the usual sounds of morning activity. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Hannah Morrison rose before dawn, as she had every morning for the past 7 years. But today her hands were perfectly steady as she dressed in her plain cotton work dress and wrapped her hair in the faded blue head wrap that had belonged to her mother. Today there was no fear in her heart, only the cold certainty of justice finally arriving. At 5:30 she walked through the misty courtyard to the kitchen house, her bare feet silent on the brick walkway. The familiar weight of the kitchen keys hung from her belt. keys that gave her access to every pantry, every spice cabinet, every secret ingredient that would make this morning's breakfast unforgettable. The kitchen was her domain, her battlefield, her temple of revenge. Hannah lit the great fireplace with practiced efficiency, the orange flames casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. She filled the iron kettle with water from the well and hung it on the crane to heat. Every movement was deliberate, ritualistic, as if she were performing a sacred ceremony that had been centuries in the making. From her hiding place beneath the loose floorboard, Hannah retrieved the small ceramic jar containing her oleander powder. The substance looked innocent enough, a fine grayish powder that could easily be mistaken for black pepper or ground herbs. But Hannah knew this powder held the power to topple empires, to strike fear into the hearts of slave owners across the entire South. She had calculated the dosages with scientific precision. Thomas Whitmore, at 200 pounds, would require approximately 2 teaspoons mixed into his coffee. Elena, much smaller and more delicate, would need only 1 teaspoon in her morning tea. James, young and strong, but also the quickest eater, would get 1½ teaspoons sprinkled over his eggs and grits. The timing had to be perfect. The Whitmore family maintained rigid breakfast schedules. Thomas always came down at exactly 7 on for his coffee and newspaper. Elena followed at 7:15 for her tea and toast. James stumbled down at 7:30, usually hungover from the previous night's drinking, demanding his eggs and bacon before he rode out to oversee the field hands. Hannah began her deadly ballet of preparation. She ground fresh coffee beans, the rich aroma filling the kitchen with false normalcy. She sliced thick pieces of bread from yesterday's loaf, arranging them on the silver serving tray that Elena preferred. She cracked eggs into a blue ceramic bowl, their golden yolks bright as summer sunshine, sunshine that the Whitmore family would never see again. At 6:45, Hannah heard the familiar sound of Thomas Whitmore's heavy footsteps on the main house's wooden floors. He was an early riser, proud of his discipline, often boasting that successful planters were made in the hour before dawn. This morning, his punctuality would be his death sentence. Hannah's heart remained calm as she poured the boiling water over the coffee grounds, watching the dark liquid drip into the pot. This was the moment she had rehearsed in her mind thousands of times. With movements as smooth as silk, she lifted the coffee pot and added Thomas Whitmore's sugar, 2 heaping spoonfuls, just as he liked it. Then, with the same casual motion, she added 2 teaspoons of oleander powder, stirring the mixture until it dissolved completely. The deadly coffee looked identical to every other cup she had served him. The oleander was tasteless and odorless when properly prepared. Thomas Whitmore would drink his death without ever knowing it was coming. Next came Elena's tea. Hannah selected the finest Ceylon leaves from the locked spice cabinet, a luxury that Elena insisted upon even as she denied her slaves adequate food. The irony was not lost on Hannah as she measured the tea into the delicate porcelain pot that had belonged to Elena's grandmother. Boiling water transformed the leaves into a golden amber liquid, beautiful and innocent looking. Hannah added Elena's preferred honey, 2 small spoonfuls from the jar imported from Savannah. Then, with the same steady hand that had prepared thousands of harmless meals, she stirred in 1 teaspoon of oleander powder. The honey masked any texture that might have given away the poison's presence. As the clock on the kitchen mantel chimed 7 times, Hannah heard Thomas Whitmore's study door open. He was coming for his coffee, just as he had every morning for the past decade. Hannah arranged his cup on the silver tray alongside the morning's copy of the Charleston Mercury, which carried news of Congress debating the expansion of slavery into new territories. How fitting, Hannah thought, that Thomas would read about the future of slavery while unknowingly drinking his own death. She carried the tray to the main house with the same unhurried pace she had maintained for years. No one would remember anything unusual about this morning. That was crucial to her plan's success. Thomas was already seated at his massive mahogany desk when Hannah entered the study, his gray hair gleaming with pomade, his face bearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed the world existed for his pleasure. "Good morning, Hannah," he said without looking up from his papers. Weather clearing up nicely. Should be perfect for the cotton planting. Yes, master, Hannah replied, her voice betraying nothing, as she set the coffee cup at his right elbow. Perfect weather indeed. Thomas lifted the cup and took his first sip of poisoned coffee at exactly 7:03. Hannah watched from the corner of her eye as he drank deeply, then set the cup down with a satisfied sigh. The oleander was already entering his bloodstream, beginning its deadly work on his cardiovascular system. Hannah returned to the kitchen to prepare Elena's breakfast. The mistress of the plantation preferred to take her morning meal in the sunroom overlooking her prized rose garden. Elena fancied herself a delicate southern belle, despite being 43 years old and harder than railroad iron when it came to punishing slaves. The tea service was an elaborate ritual that Elena insisted upon. Fine china, silver spoons, linen napkins, and fresh flowers from the garden. Hannah arranged everything with meticulous care, knowing that Elena would examine every detail for imperfections. The poisoned tea sat innocently in its porcelain pot, looking exactly like the hundreds of other pots Hannah had prepared over the years. At 7:15 precisely, Hannah knocked softly on the sunroom door. Elena was already seated at her small, round table, dressed in a morning gown of pale yellow silk, her graying hair arranged in an elaborate style that had taken her slave maid an hour to perfect. "You're exactly on time, Hannah," Elena said, with the satisfied tone of a woman who believed punctuality in slaves was a reflection of her superior household management. "Pour the tea, please, and make sure it's not too strong. I have a delicate constitution this morning." Hannah poured the poisoned tea with the same steady hand that had served Elena for 7 years. The liquid flowed golden and perfect into the delicate cup, steam rising like incense from its surface. Elena added her usual splash of cream and stirred with the silver spoon that had belonged to her great-grandmother. "Perfect temperature," Elena murmured after her first sip, taken at exactly 7:18. "How you do make the most wonderful tea, Hannah. I don't know what I would do without you." If this story is gripping you, don't forget to like the video and comment what you would do in the protagonist's place. Subscribe for more powerful narratives of struggle and survival. Hannah bowed her head respectfully. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. Will there be anything else?" "No, dear. Just let James know his breakfast is ready when he comes down. You know how he gets when his food isn't waiting." Hannah returned to the kitchen for the final preparation. James Whitmore was the youngest and cruelest member of the family, a 24-year-old man who treated slave women as his personal property and slave men as objects for his violent amusement. He had been the one to suggest selling Moses to the Louisiana sugar plantations, laughing about how the boy would learn respect the hard way. James liked his eggs over easy, his bacon crispy, and his grits swimming in butter. Hannah prepared his breakfast exactly as he preferred, then carefully sprinkled the oleander powder over the eggs and stirred it into the grits. The powder was virtually invisible against the yellow eggs and pale grits, and James always ate too quickly to notice subtle changes in texture or taste. At 7:32, James Whitmore stumbled into the dining room, his hair disheveled from sleep and his clothes rumpled from the previous night's drinking. He was already in a foul mood, shouting for his breakfast before he had even sat down. "Where's my food, Hannah? I told you I needed to be in the fields early today. We are starting the new cotton planting, and those lazy field hands need constant supervision." Hannah set his plate before him without comment. James immediately began shoveling food into his mouth, eating with the graceless hunger of a man who had never known want. He consumed the poisoned eggs in 4 large bites, followed by the deadly grits, washing everything down with milk that Hannah had not tampered with. She wanted him to taste every bite of his death. By 7:45, all 3 members of the Whitmore family had consumed their poisoned breakfast. Hannah began the normal routine of cleaning dishes and preparing for the day's other meals, her face showing no emotion as she waited for the oleander to take effect. The first symptoms appeared within 20 minutes. Hannah heard Thomas's voice from the study, initially just a confused grunt, then a more concerned call for Elena. By 8:15, both parents were in the dining room. Thomas complained of sudden chest pain, and Elena felt dizzy and nauseous. Must be something in the air, Thomas muttered, loosening his collar as sweat beaded on his forehead. Damn humidity always affects my breathing. James finished his breakfast and stood to leave for the fields, but immediately sat back down as a wave of weakness washed over him. I feel strange, he said, his voice already becoming slurred, like I can't catch my breath. Hannah continued her kitchen work, listening as the family's confusion turned to concern, then to growing panic. Elena was the first to realize something was seriously wrong. Thomas, your face is gray, she said, her own voice becoming weak and thready. And James looks terrible. Maybe we should call for Dr. Morrison. But even as Elena spoke, she was struggling to remain upright in her chair. The oleander was attacking her smaller body more quickly, causing her heart to race irregularly as her blood pressure dropped. Thomas tried to stand and immediately collapsed back into his chair, clutching his chest as pain radiated down his left arm. Can't breathe, he gasped. Something's wrong, very wrong. James attempted to call for help, but the words came out as an unintelligible croak. His young, strong body was fighting the poison, but the dose Hannah had calculated was sufficient to overwhelm even his natural resilience. By 8:30, all 3 family members were experiencing the full effects of oleander poisoning. Their hearts were beating irregularly, their breathing was labored, and their blood pressure was dropping to dangerous levels. The dining room, which had been filled with casual breakfast conversation 30 minutes earlier, now echoed with gasps and moans of increasing distress. Hannah appeared in the doorway as if summoned by their cries, her face a perfect mask of concern and confusion. Mrs., is everything all right? She asked. Thomas tried to speak, but could only point weakly toward the kitchen, as if suspecting that something in the food had caused their illness. But oleander poisoning was virtually undetectable, and Thomas's suspicions would die with him. Elena managed to whisper, "Get help. Doctor, something wrong." Hannah nodded and ran toward the slave quarters, ostensibly to send someone for medical assistance. But she knew that no doctor could arrive in time to save the Whitmore family, and even if one did, there was no antidote for oleander poisoning in 1847. By the time Hannah returned to the main house, claiming that she had sent a field hand to fetch Dr. Morrison from Charleston, Thomas Whitmore was unconscious, and James was convulsing weakly in his chair. Elena was still barely conscious, her eyes wide with fear and confusion as she realized she was dying. "Hannah," Elena whispered, reaching out with a trembling hand. "Help us, please." Hannah knelt beside Elena's chair, taking the dying woman's hand in hers. For a moment their eyes met, and Hannah saw the exact instant when Elena realized the truth. The recognition flickered across Elena's face, understanding that the trusted house slave who had served her family for years had just murdered them all. But Elena was too weak to speak, too close to death to raise an alarm. She could only stare at Hannah with eyes that held terror, betrayal, and adorning. Acts of resistance inspired by Hannah Morrison's careful planning and network of house slaves. Her methods had created a new paradigm of rebellion, one fought not with open violence, but with intelligence, patience, and invisibility. Knowledge became a weapon, and the invisible army that Hannah had cultivated continued to grow, quietly undermining the plantation system from within. By combining careful observation, botanical expertise, and a deep understanding of human psychology, Hannah had shown that enslaved people could resist in ways that left no trace for white society to detect. Her legacy spread far beyond Charleston. Whispers of the invisible cook reached distant plantations, inspiring other house slaves to take note of their master's routines, cultivate networks of communication, and plan acts of retribution that would protect their families and assert their dignity. The revolutionary impact of Hannah's work was not measured in battles or uprisings, but in the subtle fear that gripped the white elite. Plantation owners began questioning every meal, every servant, every moment of trust they had taken for granted. The very foundation of the plantation household, the illusion of complete control, was shaken. Hannah's success proved that intelligence and patience could wield power as effectively as brute force, and her philosophy of measured, deliberate resistance would echo across the South for decades. Though she remained outwardly a loyal servant, Hannah Morrison had transformed the rules of engagement for the enslaved. By the mid-1850s, she was widely regarded as a master strategist among house slaves, a teacher of subtle rebellion, and a symbol of invisible yet unstoppable justice. In the shadows of Charleston's wealth and splendor, Hannah had ensured that the seeds of resistance would continue to grow, quietly, invisibly, but inexorably, until the age of slavery itself would finally be challenged and eventually overthrown. The deaths at the Whitmore plantation were remembered differently by each community. To white society, a tragic accident; to the enslaved, the first act of a quiet revolution that would spread like wildfire, fueled by knowledge, courage, and the unyielding desire for justice. Hannah Morrison's legacy became the blueprint for a new kind of rebellion, one in which invisibility was power, and patience and intelligence were weapons that no whip or chain could ever break. This concluding section of the narrative beautifully ties together Hannah Morrison's story as both a literal and symbolic figure of resistance. It shows how her actions, carefully planned, patient, and intelligent, catalyzed a broader movement of defiance among enslaved people. Her use of knowledge, strategy, and invisibility challenged the very foundations of the plantation system, shifting the balance of power in subtle but profound ways. A few key takeaways stand out. Psychological. Resistance. Hannah's primary weapon wasn't brute force, it was strategy, patience, and intelligence. By exploiting the trust white masters had in their house slaves, she demonstrated how perceived subservience could mask immense power. Her actions created a ripple of fear among plantation owners, fundamentally undermining their sense of security and control. Networks and communication. The story emphasizes the importance of invisible networks among enslaved people. Through coded messages, shared knowledge of plants, and careful observation of routines, Hannah created a sophisticated system of intelligence and resistance that extended far beyond her own plantation. This network illustrates how collective organization and communication can amplify the impact of individual acts of defiance. Strategic influence on history. Hannah's example affected events beyond her immediate context. Her methods influenced others' resistance, contributed to broader societal paranoia among white planters, and even played a role during the Civil War as intelligence gathering. She demonstrates that revolutionary acts don't always appear in battlefields. They can unfold quietly in kitchens, parlors, and invisible networks. Legacy and memory. The narrative underscores how Hannah's life continued to inspire long after her death. Her work was preserved through oral histories and influenced future movements, including the civil rights movement, showing that acts of resistance can echo across generations. Moral complexity and justice. The story confronts the reader with the ethical weight of Hannah's actions. She committed murder, but it was portrayed as deliberate justice against a system that had treated human beings as property. This complexity invites reflection on power, oppression, and the forms that righteous resistance can take. Overall, Hannah Morrison emerges not just as a historical figure, but as a symbol of ingenuity, courage, and the moral assertion of justice against systemic cruelty. Her final meal on March 15, 1847, becomes a turning point, a moment where knowledge, strategy, and moral conviction combine to shift the course of history.